Picture this, a car company that had spent decades building big, heavy, expensive machines for wealthy Frenchmen decides, almost out of nowhere, to bet its future on something small, something cheap. Something built on technology it had never once used in its history. That company was Peugeot, and the car was the 204. Nobody outside the factory gates believed it would work. Peugeot's name meant large saloons, solid engineering, and prices that kept ordinary families out of the showroom. Front-wheel drive, the very thing this new car would be built around, wasn't even Peugeot territory. That was Citroën's game, perfected since 1934. For Peugeot to walk onto that turf was, to people inside the industry, close to reckless. But here's what nobody tells you about this story. This wasn't some rushed, panicked gamble. It was quiet, patient, almost secretive. And by the time the public ever laid eyes on it, the real risk had already been taken, years earlier, behind closed doors. The story begins in the mid-1950s, when Peugeot found itself with a gap it couldn't ignore. Its smaller model, the 203, had gone out of production, leaving the 403 standing alone as the entry point. But the 403 was too large and too expensive for a huge slice of ordinary buyers. There was a hole in the lineup, right where the working family should have been. So Peugeot handed its engineers a demanding brief. Build something with interior space that matched the roomy 403, capable of cruising above 130 kilometers per hour, more than 80 miles an hour, while still delivering strong, honest fuel economy, all required at once, in a small, affordable package. They got to work, quietly. Under the internal codename Project D12, engineers began sketching what would eventually become the 204. Early prototypes were already testing on private roads by 1961, 4 full years before the public would ever hear the name. Pre-production versions were rolling by 1963. This wasn't a car rushed to market. It was built in the shadows, tested, broken, rebuilt, and tested again, for the better part of a decade before anyone outside the company knew it existed. And here's the part that should grab your attention. Peugeot didn't just design this car on paper and hope for the best. They sent it into the harshest conditions they could find, entering it into punishing rallies across Africa, brutal heat, broken roads, no mercy for weak engineering. When those cars came back, dusty, battered, pushed past their limits, engineers stripped them down completely and studied every single failure point. Whatever they learned went straight back into the next batch of test cars. This was engineering by brutal, real-world proof, not boardroom guesswork. Now, back to the gamble. Because building the car was only half the risk, Peugeot didn't just need a car that worked. It needed a car that looked like nothing else they had ever made, and yet still felt unmistakably like a Peugeot. That job went to the Italian design house Pininfarina, led by Battista Pininfarina himself, the same studio responsible for Peugeot's flagship model, the 404. But here's the twist. Instead of giving the small car the same bold, finned, aggressive styling as its big brother, Pininfarina pulled back, deliberately. The 204 was given softer lines, a calmer face, nothing flashy. At a time when French car design was chasing American styling trends, tail fins, sharp edges, chrome for the sake of chrome, this little car went the other way entirely. It looked European, restrained, almost quiet about its own ambition. And despite its small footprint, the body was built wider than average for its class, which is exactly how Peugeot managed to squeeze in interior space that could stand next to the much larger 404. That restraint was intentional. Peugeot wasn't trying to shout. They were trying to earn trust. There was also a practical reason behind the engine size Peugeot settled on. French tax law at the time placed cars into horsepower-based classes for the purposes of annual road tax, and 1,130 cubic centimeters was the largest displacement allowed to stay inside the favorable 6-horsepower tax bracket. Every decision, the design, the size, the engine, was being made with the ordinary buyer's wallet in mind, not just at the moment of purchase, but every single year afterward. None of this came cheap on Peugeot's end, though. Turning a small, restrained little saloon into a mass-market product meant serious investment in tooling, machinery, and production capacity. Money committed to a car that, at the time it was being spent, hadn't sold a single unit to a single customer. That's not a comfortable position for any company to be in. On the 22nd of April, 1965, the gamble finally stepped into the light. The 204 was unveiled to Peugeot dealers in Paris and shown to the wider public the following day. The base four-door saloon carried a price tag of 8,950 French francs, positioned squarely within reach of the middle class. Peugeot had never truly served before. And here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks. Before that car had even rolled onto a single showroom floor for public sale, Peugeot already had more than 5,000 pre-orders sitting on the books. 5,000 people who had never driven it, never seen it move, putting their money down anyway. Something about this car, even sight unseen, had already started to work. A strong debut isn't the same as lasting success, though. Plenty of cars launch well and fade fast. What actually sat under that restrained little body is where Peugeot took its biggest technical leap, and it's worth slowing down on. The 204 was the first Peugeot ever built with front-wheel drive. Not an experiment, not a limited trim, every single one, from launch day onward. Paired with that was an all-aluminum, single overhead cam engine mounted transversely, sideways, across the engine bay, producing 53 horsepower at launch, driving through a 4-speed manual gearbox. It also arrived with front disc brakes and fully independent coil spring suspension on all 4 corners, features that, at this price point, in this segment, were almost unheard of. Now look at the actual size of the thing, because the numbers tell their own story. A wheelbase of 2,595 millimeters, a length of just under 4 meters, a width of 1,560 millimeters, and a curb weight of only 851 kilograms, under 1,900 pounds. A genuinely small, light car, yet one engineered to feel like it belonged in a class above its price. Pay attention to this part, because it matters. None of these individual technologies were brand new to the automotive world. Front-wheel drive patents dated back to the 1890s. Citroën had been building it since 1934. Transverse engines had already made the Mini a sensation back in 1959. Peugeot wasn't inventing anything here. What they were doing was harder. They were taking scattered, proven ideas that nobody had successfully combined into one affordable, reliable package, and building exactly that, wrapped in a body that didn't scream about any of it. Before we go further, if you're enjoying this kind of real automotive history, the kind with actual numbers and actual stakes behind it, do me a favor and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this one. And if a detail here jogs a memory, an old 204 you owned, a neighbor who drove one, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Now, the lineup didn't stop at the 4-door saloon. Within about 6 months, a 5-door estate version arrived in the autumn of 1965. By 1966, Peugeot added a 2-door convertible and a 3-door coupe, both riding on a shortened chassis, priced only around 20% above the standard saloon. Later that same year came a van variant, the fourgonnette, following the estate's basic shape but with a single door on each side and steel panels replacing the rear side windows. One shared foundation, 5 distinct bodies. Here's the detail that quietly changed everything, and it doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Toward the end of 1968, Peugeot introduced a diesel option for the estate and van versions, a 1,255 cubic centimeter engine. At the time, this is believed to have been the smallest diesel engine ever fitted into a commercially available car anywhere in the world. Think about what that meant. Peugeot had taken a technology usually reserved for trucks and heavy-duty vehicles and shrunk it down into a small family car, years before diesel would become common in passenger cars across Europe. In April of 1973, that diesel unit was enlarged to 1,357 cubic centimeters. And by September of 1975, the diesel finally became available on the 4-door saloon itself, not just the estate and van. Even so, out of roughly 150,000 diesel 204s built in total, fewer than 30,000 of them were saloons. Most buyers who wanted the diesel were still choosing the estate or the van. Here's why that matters. Diesel passenger cars simply weren't a mainstream choice yet. Most European buyers avoided them entirely, unless the vehicle was large enough to work as a taxi, where the fuel savings justified the trade-offs. That wouldn't really change until the early 1980s, when Volkswagen began heavily promoting the diesel version of the Golf, badged the Rabbit, in some markets. Peugeot, in other words, had been sitting on a genuinely forward-looking piece of engineering for over a decade before the rest of the industry caught up to the idea. The petrol side of the range kept evolving too. In September of 1975, less than a year before production finally ended, the original 1,130 cubic centimeter engine was replaced with a newer 1,127 cubic centimeter unit. Claimed output climbed from the original 53 horsepower up to 59, even with a slight reduction in torque. That same updated engine would go on to power a version of Peugeot's next model, the 304 Estate, where its smaller displacement carried real tax advantages in France compared to the larger engines fitted to most 304s. This wasn't a company playing it safe with a small, cute little economy car. This was a company quietly stacking one calculated risk on top of another, refining constantly, betting that all of it, together, would finally pay off. And it was about to. And this wasn't a story that stayed confined to French roads either. As production ramped up, the 204 found its way into export markets across Europe, reaching buyers in West Germany, and beyond the continent entirely, into parts of Africa and South America. For a car built around a French tax bracket and French buying habits, that kind of international reach wasn't guaranteed. It had to be earned, market by market. And Peugeot didn't just ship the same car everywhere and hope it worked. For certain export markets where fuel quality was lower, where higher octane petrol simply wasn't reliably available, engineers reduced the engine's compression ratio, and, with it, some of its power output, trading a bit of performance for an engine that would actually survive on the fuel customers could get. It's a small, unglamorous detail, but it tells you something important. This wasn't a company that built one car and hoped the world would adapt to it. It was a company willing to adjust the machine itself to fit the reality on the ground, wherever that reality happened to be. Remember those brutal African rallies from earlier in this story? The ones used to stress test the car before it ever reached showrooms. That same unforgiving terrain that helped prove the 204's durability during development became, in time, one of the very regions where the finished car was actually sold and driven. The proving ground and the marketplace weren't separate things. They were the same roads, the same climate, the same demands, first as a test, later as a daily reality for real owners. That's the kind of detail that gets lost when people tell this story in one sentence. Small Peugeot became a bestseller. It skips over just how much groundwork, how much adjustment, how much unglamorous engineering had to happen behind the scenes before a single unit could be sold anywhere outside France, let alone become the best-selling car in the country that built it. Which brings us to the moment all of this had been building toward. Here's the part nobody wants to admit when they tell this story with rose-colored glasses. When the 204 first hit French roads, plenty of ordinary buyers were still skeptical. Peugeot's reputation had been built on solid, expensive, slightly old-fashioned cars for people who already had money. Convincing working families that this same company could suddenly build something small, modern, and genuinely for them wasn't automatic. Trust doesn't transfer overnight just because a factory says so. But the car kept doing what it was built to do. It kept proving itself, one buyer, one honest test drive, one rally finish at a time. Sales climbed steadily through the late 1960s, and slowly, the skepticism started to crack. By 1969, something happened that had never happened before in Peugeot's entire history. The 204 became the best-selling car in all of France. Not the best-selling Peugeot, the best-selling car, period, ahead of every rival on the market, and it didn't happen for just one lucky year. It held that position for 3 consecutive years, from 1969 through 1971. Let that sink in for a moment. A company known for large, costly saloons had just won the most competitive, most crowded segment in the entire French car market, with the smallest, cheapest, riskiest car it had ever built. And the ripple effects went far beyond bragging rights. This single model helped push Peugeot past two of its biggest domestic rivals, Simca and Citroën, in overall sales. The company jumped from fourth place in the French market all the way to second. A gamble born nearly a decade earlier, out of a gap in the lineup and a code name on an engineer's drawing board, had just rewritten Peugeot's entire position in its home market. By the time production finally wound down in 1976, more than 1,600,000 units of the 204 had rolled off the line. 1,604,296, to be exact, one car, over a decade. And 2,000. 1.6 million examples sold, driven, and trusted by ordinary families across France and beyond. This is the part of the story most people never hear. The 204 wasn't just a nice little car that sold decently. It fundamentally changed what Peugeot was allowed to be. It's the difference between a company that makes cars and a company that makes the right car at exactly the right moment. But what happened after this success is just as important as the success itself. Success like that doesn't just sit still. It gets reinvested. Peugeot took the momentum, the profits, and the confidence the 204 had earned them, and used it to push even further into territory they'd once considered too risky. In 1969, the same year the 204 claimed its crown, Peugeot launched the 304. A slightly larger evolution built directly on everything the 204 had proven, right down to sharing its updated engine in later years. And by the end of 1972, they went even smaller, launching the 104, marketed at the time as Europe's smallest four-door saloon. A company that had once refused to touch small, affordable cars was now building an entire family of them, because one uncomfortable, expensive, uncertain bet had shown them it could work. Here's what this story really comes down to. Peugeot didn't succeed because they played it safe. They succeeded because they were willing to walk away from everything that had defined them. Big, expensive, conservative cars, and build something they had never proven they could build. Front-wheel drive they'd never used, a tax bracket built around an ordinary family's budget, a price point aimed at customers they'd never truly served. Every piece of that could have failed. Any one of those decisions, on its own, could have sunk the whole project. Instead, it became the best-selling car in the country that helped invent so much of the modern automobile industry. It pushed a fourth-place manufacturer into second. It sold over 1.6 million units across a decade of production. And it quietly funded the next chapter of Peugeot's expansion into the small car market, a chapter that never would have happened if that first, quiet gamble, in the mid-1950s, had gone the other way. If there's a lesson buried in all of this, it's simple. The biggest transformations rarely come from the safe choice. They come from the decision everyone around you thinks is too risky, made anyway, and followed through with total commitment, right down to the tax class on the engine and the price tag on the showroom floor. If this story took you back, if you remember riding in one of these, or a family member owned one, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments exactly what stuck with you most, whether it was the diesel engine that shouldn't have existed at that size, or the 5,000 people who bought a car they'd never even seen. And if you want more stories like this one, real automotive history, told straight, no filler, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and if you know someone who'd appreciate this story, an old car enthusiast, a former Peugeot owner, someone who lived through this era, send it their way. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.